Hello everyone, Livia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm going to go on to the next video, The Explorer's Daughter by Kari Herbert. After this I actually have one last video that I'll try and do for today, which will be Explorers or Boys Messing About by Stephen Morrison. But I'll be honest, with that video, it might be shorter in comparison to the others, just because even I found that text quite challenging in what to talk about. I'm not a huge enthusiast about newspaper articles. I still found a lot of stuff that I can share with you to try and give you inspiration for how you might want to go about analysing it. And I picked up on different things, but it wasn't a text that really kind of like connected with me. Like sometimes I find it easier to access texts that I connect with a bit more, but I still found elements that I can talk about and analyse. But that's just to give a heads up for that video. Okay, so I'll start with context as I always do, and then I'll read out the non-fiction text, The Explorer's Daughter by Kari Herbert, and then I'll go into my talk about some of the analysis and any like of the kind of tricky words that occur in this text. And once again, like with the other text, there'll be particular words that I won't be able to pronounce, but we'll just have to deal with that. So the context of this piece is that Kari's father was a polar explorer, and as a child she lived in northwest Greenland in the Arctic, and she returned to Greenland as an adult to write about it. So The Explorer's Daughter is an extract from her memoir, which is a piece of writing that's written from a personal experience, similar to like an autobiography, but it's also partly written as like a travel guide. So it's like if you were to visit Greenland in the Arctic, her writing kind of would allow you to access or give you an idea of what visiting that country would be like. And she's interested in the way of the life of the Inuit people, and the Inuit people were formerly known as Eskimos. So the kind of like tribal community that lives in the Arctic, and she's interested in how the way of their lives are changing due to the impact of the modern world. Some traditions still remain, so such as hunting for food and driving teams of dogs like with their sleds. And what she writes about is an account of a narwhal hunt that's going on, and for her it's a very emotive issue. Her stance is neutral, so she sympathises with both sides. She sympathises with the narwhals who are being hunted, and she sympathises with the humans, the Inuit people, who need to hunt them in order to survive, essentially. So she's not taking a biased view, she's taking a very diplomatic, neutral view to this issue. And yeah, I'm gonna read it now. I just need to get the pictures up on my phone. Okay. 2 hours after the last of the hunters had returned and eaten, narwhal were spotted again, this time very close. Within an hour, even those of us on shore could with the naked eye see the plumes of spray from the narwhal catching the light in a spectral play of colour. 2 large pods of narwhal circled in the fjord, often looking as if they were going to merge, but always slowly, methodically passing each other by. Scrambling back up to the lookout, I looked across the glittering kingdom in front of me and took a sharp intake of breath. The hunters were dotted all around the fjord. The evening light was turning butter gold, glinting off man and whale and catching the soft billows of smoke from a lone hunter's pipe. From where we sat at the lookout, it looked as though the hunters were close enough to touch the narwhal with their bare hands, and yet they never moved. Distances are always deceptive in the Arctic. This is kind of like where the travel log part comes in. And I fell to wondering if the narwhal existed at all, or were instead mischievous tricks of the shifting light. The narwhal rarely stray from high Arctic waters, escaping only to the slightly more temperate waters towards the Arctic Circle in the dead of winter, but never entering the warmer southern seas. In summer, the hunters of Tool are fortunate to witness the annual return of the narwhal to the Inglefield Fjord on the side of which we now sat. The narwhal was an essential contributor to the survival of the hunters in the high Arctic. The mattak, or blubber, of the whale is rich in necessary minerals and vitamins, and in a place where the climate prohibits the growth of vegetables or fruit, this rich source of vitamin C was the one reason that the Eskimos had never suffered from scurvy. For centuries, the blubber of the whales was also the only source of light and heat, and the dark, rich meat is still a valuable part of the diet for both man and dogs. A single narwhal can feed a team of dogs for an entire month. Its single ivory tusk, which can grow up to 6 feet in length, was used for harpoon tips and handles for other hunting implements, although the ivory was found to be brittle and not hugely satisfactory as a weapon. For carving protective tupperlacks, which are like charms, and I think I'll just check that because I wrote a note down for what that word means. Yeah, charms or figures with magical powers is like a part of their religious belief system, and even as a central beam for their small ancient dwellings. Strangely, the tusk seems to have little use for the narwhal itself. They do not use the tusk to break through ice as a breathing hole, nor will they use it to catch or attack prey, but rather the primary use seems to be to disturb the top of the seabed in order to catch Arctic halibut, for which they have a particular predilection. So that means like they're kind of predisposed, or they tend to go for this particular type of I think halibut is a fish, so it's like a particular food that they like. Often the ends of their tusk are worn down or even broken from such usage. The women clustered on the knoll of the lookout, binoculars pointing in every direction, each woman focusing on her husband or family member, occasionally spinning round at a small gasp or jump as one of the women saw a hunter near a narwhal. Each wife knew her husband instinctively and watched their progress intently. It was crucial to her that her husband catch a narwhal. It was part of their staple diet, and some of the mattak and meat could be sold to other hunters who hadn't been so lucky, bringing in so much needed extra income. Every hunter was on the water. It was like watching a vast, waterborne game with the hunters spread like a net around the sound. The narwhal are intelligent creatures. Their senses are keen and they talk to one another underneath the water. Their hearing is particularly developed and they can hear the sound of a paddling kayak from a great distance. That was why the hunters had to sit so very still in the water. One hunter was almost on top of a pair of narwhal, and they were huge. He gently picked up his harpoon and aimed. In that split second my heart leapt for both hunter and narwhal. I urged the man on in my head. He was so close, and so brave to attempt what he was about to do. He was miles from land in a flimsy kayak and could easily be capsized and drowned. The hunter had no rifle, only one harpoon with 2 heads and 1 bladder. It was a foolhardy exercise and one that could only inspire respect. And yet at the same time my heart also urged the narwhal to dive, to leave, to survive. This dilemma stayed with me the whole time that I was in Greenland. I understand the harshness of life in the Arctic and the needs of the hunters and their families to hunt and live on animals and sea mammals that we demand to be protected because of their beauty, and I know that one cannot afford to be sentimental in the Arctic. How can you possibly eat seal? I have been asked over and over again. True, the images that bombarded us several years ago of men battering seals for their fur hasn't helped the issue of polar hunting. But the Inuit do not kill seals using this method, nor do they kill for sport. They use every part of the animals they kill, and most of the food in Tool is still brought in by the hunter-gatherers and fishermen. Imported goods can only ever account for part of the food supply. There is still only one annual supply ship that makes its way through the ice to Quinnac, and the small twice-weekly plane from West Greenland can only carry a certain amount of goods. Hunting is still an absolute necessity in Tool. So that's the end of the extract. Okay. So in the beginning you really see that there's this sense of poetic or romanticised description of the narwhals and their natural beauty. It almost creates like a magical realism sort of feel, how she makes them mystical. and the pauses throughout the text in the beginning kind of represent the peaceful scenario in the beginning of like watching these narwhals out in the water, and like the metaphor glistering kingdom, it's like majestic, regal, untouched, this idea that these narwhals are living in this kind of like paradise, and yet you also have that kind of juxtaposition between the metaphor and yet a magical realism feel of like being quite a literal scene that's happening. Throughout, it's very factual and informative. There's a lot of climate orientated language, and like it's very objective about hunting, so it's not emotively driven. Scientific language, and it almost has like quite a historical tone, especially with the use of parenthesis and like, yeah, the parenthesis to emphasize or justify their actions. So like in the bracket bit where it talks about how like one narwhal can feed like a family of Inuit people and like their team of dogs for like an entire month, and there's no waste. It shows there's also religious purposes, and once again that feeds into this kind of ethical debate around conservation, because conservation means no waste, and well, conservation is about protecting animals, but this idea that the Inuit people are not creating waste and they're not hunting for sport, they're hunting for survival, that can be seen as an ethical form of conservation, because they're not just wasting or depleting numbers for their own selfish reasons, they're doing it for a legitimate reason. And the kind of religious purpose side of it, how they even use the tusks, shows that it's culturally significant. There's an interesting moment where that tone kind of shifts a bit, where she starts talking about the narwhals. And there was like the comparison to the limited use that the narwhals use for it. There's a moment where she starts to anthropomorphise the narwhals. So that's when anthropomorphism is when animals are given human qualities. So how she describes them as being able to talk underwater, like obviously narwhals communicate with sonar like other sea mammals, but the way she refers to it as them talking, like obviously not, it's like that kind of metaphorical anthropomorphism where it's kind of like turning them almost into humans, because yes, they do communicate, but they don't communicate with words like we do. So it's kind of a moment where she starts to like give them a bit more of a human perspective. And the verb, apparently I mentioned a point, the verb animalistic, clustered. Oh yeah, so like when the hunters and the narwhals are all together on the water, that becomes quite an animalistic scene. And this idea that they're all clustered together. Verbs are short, rapid, during that scene, which shows the piece is like being disturbed. There's high stakes, so it kind of increases the tension of the piece. Family affair, like with the women watching their husbands out on the water. It's a very primitive description. It becomes very much about survival. The determiner, every, and the simile, it's like interesting. It like might be a shift in objectivity. So where she's kind of like talks about the idea of like everyone is relying on this hunt to be successful. The anthropomorphism is simplistic, and once again it's a slight loss of objective language. And oh sorry, I've already mentioned that bit about the talk to one another. Divided, and the pause emphasizes narwhal's size. Precision and structure is like reflecting the delicate act of hunting. There's no brutality, so even though this is a hunt scene, it's very precise and it's very quiet, and even though the piece is being disturbed, there's no like aggressive use of descriptions, there's no like aggressive verbs really. And then the final bit is kind of the morality struggle is emphasized by the use of the adjective whole. So she also talks about like media issues and the macrocosm of like she descends into like long sentences which are quite impassioned, because she kind of ends this part of the extract. Oh, because the end part of the extract kind of links to I am losing the will. It kind of relates to this idea that the hunters need this for survival. So although she isn't being biased and she's trying to be neutral to both parties, there is a potential that she is siding a bit more with the Inuit people. And there's a subtle acknowledgement of her experience, and we would not know without context. So she doesn't need to justify why she has lived it, because it's like when people have asked of her, how could you eat seals? She doesn't actually go into detail of why she needs to, because of the context of the piece and because she's actually lived it and experienced living out in the Arctic. She doesn't need to justify that. So I hope this video has helped. As always, if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. And I'm sorry, I'm trying my best, but I'm obviously not at my capacity of being able to function. But I will try and get that last video done today, because then that'll be a nice set of non-fiction text to keep you guys going until I can get round to the other ones. So if anyone's watched this, thank you, and I hope it helps. Bye.